Welcome everyone. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Global Water Futures Core Modeling webinar series. My name is Pravin Rokhaya. I'm the science coordinator of the Core Modeling and Forecasting team, and I wanted to thank you all for joining us today, despite many online meetings and webinars that we are having these days. So we really appreciate your engagement. Today we have Professor Al Petronero from the University of Calgary, who will be presenting on advances in hydrological forecasting. It would be about 45 minutes of presentation, followed by 15 minutes of question and answer session. Before we begin, I wanted to share that this is our final webinar for 2020-2021 session. Later in fall, we'll be back again with the second season of core modeling webinars, so please stay tuned. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Al Petronero. Al is chair in Sustainable Water System and Climate Change at the University of Calgary. He is also former Executive Director of the National Hydrological Services of Environment and Climate Change Canada. In core modeling, he is one of the two co-principal investigators and the faculty lead of the hydrological forecasting team. The hydrological forecasting theme is advancing hydrological prediction capabilities in three main areas: building new systems, improving hydrological prediction, and implementing test beds for rapid prototyping, which I believe Al will be highlighting today. Al, we are very happy and grateful to have you here today. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Praveen. So we'll get started right away here. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to update everybody. This is a bit of a labor of love, I guess, on my part, and really enjoying this project. We're working with a lot of folks, and as you'll see through the discussion here, hydrological forecasting, and we'll focus mostly on flood forecasting in Canada, is a bit complicated, but we're moving forward in lots of ways. So hopefully I'll give you a bit of a sense of how this all works, kind of what we've tried to do with my former position in ECC and how that's moving along, and then some of the research challenges and sort of what the group is doing with respect to moving some yardsticks forward. Okay, so everybody's familiar with this rubric here. So hydrological forecasting is one of the main elements in the core modeling research theme, and so that's what I'll be focusing on today. Here's all the folks involved. Nice to see some folks from Waterloo and McMaster with Paulin and James involved. And then of course there's myself and Martin who are co-leading. And then Carl, who's done a lot of great work on lots of aspects of the modeling actually. And then of course John, who's the PI of GWF and who also is contributing to this thematic in some considerable ways. We have lots of great postdocs and students and others listed below. Apurva and Chris, and Dave is just starting his PhD. Yongo at McMaster, Louise, Sujata, and Jibang Liu from who's in Canmore. And then we've got collaborators: Andy Wood from NCAR, Florian Pappenberger for ECMWF, and Vincent Fortin and Vincent Pianet out of ECC. So what I'm going to talk about, what I thought I'd do is give you a bit of context for this theme in GWF. So I kind of jokingly wrote down, where in the world are things going, and what is Canada doing, just to set some context, and then we'll go through the projects quite quickly. So I'll fly through these slides quickly. You can always refer to them later. You'll have a copy of this, right? But I just a couple of things you need to understand, I think, on why we do things the way we do them, and how GWF has kind of tried to ensure that we're in a kind of a realistic framework with respect to what we're doing on the flood forecasting side. So I think some of you have seen me present this many times, right? As a former government person, you really got to work within the bounds of the legislation that you're allowed to work in. And so the BNA Act, for those of you who know, basically gives the provinces the responsibility of natural resources, including water. But there is something called the Canada Water Act, and there's a few other acts that allow some federal involvement in certain aspects on the water resources side, mostly focused on the international transboundary, where there's a treaty with the US or some kind of water licensing required for transboundary rivers, or sorry, international rivers or transboundary waters. But given all that and what's happening globally, in 2018, I worked with Vincent Fortin and others in the research community to look at developing a national flow guidance system. This was funding that came through a special Treasury Board submission to both modernize the National Hydrological Service and fix a lot of the infrastructure issues, but also to actually look at developing a national framework for prediction within ECCC. And I'll explain why it's important that we do that federally, even though the mandate sits with the provinces. So some of the drivers for change for forecasting, I think most of you would be aware of this. You know, climate change and resilience is a big issue, adaptive management. Certainly the technologies change. I think we're all aware of that. Things are radically different from what they were 10 years ago. We do live in a digital age, right? That's pretty clear. Lots of work with AI and other big data systems, right? And then we are moving towards open government. I mean, this has been something that's been in the works for a long time. And so I think some of the work we'd like to do in the forecasting field really is maturing because of the way some of the drivers for change that we're seeing in Canada. To put some context around this, I pulled up the Parliamentary Bureau Office, Parliamentary Office's report of 2016 on DFFA as the disaster payments arrangement that we have in Canada, where the federal government pays for certain disasters across the board. And a couple of take-home messages here I think are important to understand, and why we need to move to a sort of a national context in terms of flood forecasting and flood mitigation. And one is that if you look at the chart on the right, what you'll see is in terms of all the disaster payments, so this is 2016 to 2020, floods represented the largest percentage, about 75% of all the flood or all the damages paid in Canada. From winter storms or convective storms or hurricanes, floods is definitely number one. And then if you look over the last 10 years, from 2005 to 2014, it's interesting to note that Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta have accounted for 82% of all weather events and costs, which most of them are flooding. So it's a pretty big issue in Canada. Obviously, things are changing and we need to keep track of that. If you kind of look at the historical payments over the years, you'll see flooding as pretty consistent, large percentage, with the exception of 1995 to 2004. The percentage of flooding is always kind of in the 80 to 90% range in terms of all disasters in Canada. So clearly, developing a national framework for flood forecasting is important. So this is some of the slides that Vincent Fortin presented at a recent meeting we had with the provinces and territories and a few others. So I won't go into too much detail here, but just to bring across the point that CMC, so the folks that run the numerical weather model in Environment and Climate Change Canada, were asked to develop a national framework for flood guidance. And just a little bit of an anecdote, when we were developing this framework, and I worked really hard with the folks in our atmospheric science group, or the researchers, and then with our operational folks who run the numerical model to develop this, it was always very clear that we were developing a flow guidance system, not a flood forecasting system. And so you really need to understand the difference between the two, right? And they are quite different. And so, it's still the responsibility of the provinces and territories to issue the flood forecast, to do the flood forecast, to figure out what the water levels are going to be. We're probably never going to get to that level in Canada, or if we do, we'll do it in partnerships through something like the New Water Agency. But right now, there's a kind of distinct roles, right? And a lot of local knowledge is needed at the local scale to be able to actually issue a flood forecast, right? So just because you can run them all doesn't mean you can do forecast. So it's important to remember. So just some kind of neat slides on some history here. So the first numerical weather prediction computer came out of Montreal, and the infrastructure is still there. Obviously, they've changed over the years. But for those of you who probably weren't even born, I'm sure most of you weren't even born when these computers were developed, this is kind of what they look like. So you can imagine, you know, but some of the first numerical weather models in the world were actually developed in Canada. A lot of people don't know that, but there was sort of the pioneers of numerical weather modeling actually came from Canada. This kind of gives you a sense, this I got from Michel Jean, of kind of where we're going. So there's been a series of supercomputers added to the infrastructure of Environment Climate Change Canada. And so you can see this goes up to 2017, right? And the plot on the right is actually megaflops, but it's a log plot. And so you can see that the computing power has increased immensely, and so has the forecast quality, right? And so there's a straight, I'm sure this will level off at some point, but there's a straight relationship between what we can do on the computing side versus you know, how well we can forecast, right? So this line here shows the Cray computer. I actually am old enough to remember where that sat in the building at the CMC in Dorval. This next slide sort of shows you sort of the computing capacity of the Cray at the time. So this is about 1984, and it was equivalent to basically the early iPhone. So things have changed a lot, right? So given all those changes, this is kind of, and this might be a little bit dated, but this is kind of where we are with what's done on the atmospheric side of the house, I guess, in terms of timescales and the type of model outputs that are being operated right now. So, you know, it's not just one numerical weather model that's being run. Actually, it's a series of different types of processes that are run, and it's quite complex. And so there's lots of capacity on the computing systems, but there's also a lot being done, right? So there's ensemble predictions, there's global, there's regional, there's nested, and there's even some work on sort of urban scale forecasting for some of the larger cities in Canada that's being done. And then of course, add on to that, the RCM and GCM simulations that are done on the same infrastructure. So what's happening in the world of hydrology, and I think most of you are aware of this, is that we're seeing kind of a convergence of models here, and it's really largely convergence of scales, if you like. So you know, we recognize this probably 15 years ago, that there's an opportunity to bring these two systems together. Obviously, the atmospheric hydrological models are getting finer resolution. We're looking at things like lake and river hydraulic and ecosystem models, and really looking at a convergence of all these scales. So the time is right to kind of move some of this forward, and that's what we're trying to do in GWF, right? So since about, I'd say about 2008, Environment and Climate Change Canada, largely with the leadership of people like Pierre Pellerin, who you might know, and Vincent Fontaine, have moved things forward with respect to developing a hydrological prediction system in Canada, and the funding for actually putting something into operations began in 2018, where we had a sort of a formal request from the federal government to move these things forward, right? And so there's clearly a big tie here with GWF, and there's a long history through other networks, CCRN and other things, where we've tried to make sure that, you know, the universities would contribute to the process here, and help move things forward for Canada. So one of those efforts is on the GEM Hydro development. This is largely a CMC development here. GEM Hydro uses the land surface scheme SVS, which is developed by Etienne Gabary. And but it's very similar to what we've been doing on our side of the house with respect to GWF on the mesh modeling. There's lots of reasons for that. I'll say that in a second, but the modeling framework is exactly the same in a lot of ways. So this one, the GEM Hydro model uses SVS as the land surface model. Mesh, which we developed for a lot of reasons, including doing some climate change studies, is different in that it uses class, and it's got a few more additional sort of routing techniques built into it. But it's mostly designed for open loop simulations, and it's not really set up in a lot of ways to do operational forecasting. Although we are looking at some experiments to try to see if that's even possible. So why do we have this mesh system? You know, everybody gets confused as to why we have it, right? And it's pretty straightforward. As an open loop system and as kind of a community platform, it's actually designed to be flexible and change. And when you develop operational systems, you can't really have that kind of flexibility. You know, any change has to be approved. There's a whole life cycle approach to dealing with code in an operational setting, right? And so you just can't, you know, turn things on and off at will, right? And so there's a lot of rigor that goes into something like Gem Hydro, and so it's not all that well suited to research. And so basically, you know, this comes from Vincent, but it's basically challenging to set up and configure, and it really is dependent kind of on the high performance computing software and hardware infrastructure, which you know, researchers just wouldn't have access to, right? And there's not a lot of support. They're pretty busy doing their day jobs, right? So they really can't support the university community. So, you know, we have our current generation hydrological modeling group in ECCC here, or sorry, in GWF here. And so, you know, I think everybody's aware of this. We've been doing a lot of work on mesh and CRIM and operationalizing the system. What's interesting in the diagram on the right is these are the major basins which we're doing future scenarios on. We've done some experiments on hindcasting here as well, obviously, with a lot of great work coming out of a lot of people. These domains are actually the ones that were chosen for the federal framework for the new forecasting system as well, right? So it's not by chance that the deliverables on the federal side of the house are the same as the GWF deliverables, right? This is part of the process here of making sure that you know, we align things in Canada as best as possible. I want to give a shout out here a bit to the next generation modeling. There's some of that's going into the forecasting team's efforts, and that'll be important. You know, we're looking for model agnostic approaches here. So we're looking for a community framework in terms of what we're doing, as opposed to a community model. And so there's lots of work being done on the next generation side too, and that will eventually tie into the forecasting system. So it's a bit complicated sometimes moving things forward in these large programs, because you've got sort of two elements. You want to do some what if work. You want to figure out what's going on. You want to do some actual hydrological analysis, determine some realities with existing modeling frameworks, right? And then of course you want to develop new modeling frameworks as well, right? And so the two don't necessarily always go hand in hand, and so you kind of have to leapfrog things in a certain way, right? And have version control and sort these things out in a reasonable way. There's always a better version of a model coming down the road, right? But you can't wait for that version to come out before you start making some, you know, start reporting on some findings in terms of the model's abilities to move things forward. So it's always a bit of a challenge to do that. So this is courtesy of a really nice paper written by one of Pauline Coulibaly's students and Trish Stadnick at the University of Calgary. And I'd encourage people to read it just to give you a sense of how it works in Canada. So just so it's clear, right? So you have this national sort of governance framework that's coming together, this sort of flow guidance system that's coming with CAPA and all these great things. But then at the end of the day, where the rubber hits the road on the flood forecast, it's actually these agencies, right? And so there's quite a few of them in Canada, that each province has its own province and territory, and Yukon developed a flood forecasting system as well. As part of their water operations. NWT doesn't actually have a flood forecasting system yet, and neither does Nunavut. And so there's still a lot of work to do in Canada to sort of bring this all together, right? And just to give you a sense, again, this paper, I'd recommend if you're interested in this topic, you read it, is really talks about sort of what we call bespoke models, which are the models that are run by these agencies, right, to issue their forecast. And so if you look here, what's interesting is there's a lot of sort of individual models being run, and to do the flood forecasts in different provinces, right? And then in some case, there's some commonalities. So there's, in terms of the old SAR model, there's sort of two jurisdictions that are using it. And then if you look at things like HEC-RAS, which is pretty standard 1D modeling, most jurisdictions are using it, right? So this gives you a sense of kind of the, I don't want to say fragmentation because that's not fair, but the sort of the different types of models that have been incorporated into the various agencies, right? And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with this. People need to use the models that they're comfortable with, that they've tuned and that they're working with. That gives them the answers they need, because the bottom line is they have to make some pretty hard decisions as flood forecasters in terms of evacuating a town or whatever they have to do. And so it's important that they feel comfortable with the models they're running and that it helps them in the decision process. So this is not a criticism at all. It's just a reality that we're dealing with in Canada, and maybe we can make some advancements there too. So going into what happens in other jurisdictions. So we had a great talk at our forecasting forum from colleagues in the US, so the Office of Water Prediction. So not unlike Canada, they've actually moved to a national water model as well. They started in 2016. But if you look at that arrow in the middle, what you'll see is the authoritative forecasts are done by the River Forecast Center. And I think there's 17 of them in the US. And they use the AHIPS system, and they use the Sacramento model. So, in a sense, they kind of operate the same way the provinces and territories do in Canada, right? Where they actually are the ones responsible for writing the evacuation notices or making things happen, right? And so the role of the national water model is, and this comes straight out of NOAA, is guidance, right? And so they provide guidance at all kinds of nodes, so more nodes than they do at the RFCs. But that guidance goes into the river forecast centers where they actually have to make the decision. So we envision something similar for Canada, right? Where ECCC will provide the guidance and the provinces will actually take that and move the yardsticks forward. The other interesting thing they're doing in the US is they're trying to make it a little more applied, in the sense of looking at LiDAR or DEM information and actually see if they estimate the flood extents in kind of quasi real time with their models. So, that's something, we should think about for Canada, maybe a research topic for folks to take on down the road here, but that certainly has some great potential in the US, and something we're really not geared up for in Canada just yet. During that same meeting, we had Florian Pappenberger come on and talk about ECMWF. So obviously they're focused on Europe, but they do global forecasts, and they actually do hydrological forecasts for places like Canada and the US. So they operate much like we would in Canada, actually, and they provide numerical guidance to the various countries as opposed to the provinces, but the same idea, where they would actually provide this, but the actual flood forecast would come from, the flood forecasting agency in Spain, or it could be even the state agencies in Spain, as an example. And so again, the same type of modeling approach, where you have sort of these larger scale models feeding into these larger scale, smaller scale systems. And this is kind of what they were looking at to have achieved by 2030. And he circled some of the more important elements, but I'll take your attention to the fact that they want to provide realistic water, energy, and carbon cycle simulations, right? So they're taking another system modeling approach as well, just like most other nations, right? Or entities, and moving this forward. So it does put us in a bit of an interesting position, I think, over the next 10 years, where imagine yourself as a forecaster in Alberta or wherever, right? And all of a sudden you have all these products and services coming at you, including from Europe and from the States and from Canada, obviously, and these other sort of national centers, right? So we're kind of into a new paradigm, I think, for forecasting. And I think one of the things we should consider down the road is helping our colleagues in the provinces and territories sort of navigate this new reality, because it's difficult, right? It's there's a lot coming at you, and it's hard to decide what's valid and what's not. And so that's just a new reality. So having said all that, hopefully I set the context for everybody, and I'll just go through quickly here and sort of go through some of the efforts we're doing within the group. I'd say if you have really sort of detailed questions, I think most of the participants and most of the people that provided these slides are here. So Pravin can certainly ask the individuals who have done this work to speak on the topic. So I'll just go through these things fairly quickly. But the focus so far has been sort of system development for flow guidance. So this larger scale effort, you know, how do we improve that? How do we do a good job for Canada? The landscapes in Canada are kind of unique globally, right? And so, you know, how do we pull all that together? So some of the efforts have been focused on that. Some have been more focused on some hydrological forecasting development, things like data assimilation and post-processing and downscaling. And then lastly, we're moving towards test beds for specific basins. So we aren't quite there yet. So some of the work done by Louise Arnall is where she's set up some test beds for her sort of national scope. But we're trying to move towards something like that, where we can actually have do some numerical experiments and move some yardsticks forward with respect to some specific ecosystems or hydrological regimes in Canada. So, and the way we've tried to evolve this work is really tie it closely with sort of what's happening with the national effort in ECCC. So try to make sure that we can influence development there. So the first project is the seasonal forecasting project in North America, with that Louise, Martin, and a whole host of people are running. So this really focused on sub-seasonal to seasonal streamflow forecasting and looked at forecasting skill. And so what she's focused on is really to produce North American-wide seasonal to sub-seasonal hydrological hindcast, and to basically quantify the seasonal predictability across Canada and North America. So there's sort of two different, and as some of you have seen this before, she's done some great presentations in the past on this, so I don't want to go into too many details, but there's sort of a data-driven workflow looking at a statistical approach for probabilistical seasonal forecasts. And then there's a process-based workflow, which is really tied to hydrological modeling, in this case, SUMA, which was calibrated and run. So I'll go over those very quickly. And if you have specific questions, you can maybe reach out to Louise. So these the workflows, the two of them that were developed, are being tested at a series of basins across the country. They kind of represent a nice cross-section, actually, from both a scaling and a regime perspective here, with the hope of testing this across all of North America. So in terms of the data-driven workflow, some reasonably successful results here, I'd say, with using some statistical Vasari-Max model, looking at basically hindcasts and being able to actually predict in a reasonable way. I think if you look at the correlations, they match quite well. So in that work, she found that the Vasari-Max statistical method worked better for low flows than the OLS. So that's just the ordinary least squares, improved the high flow hindcasts, and narrowed the uncertainty ranges. So she's developed a bit of a merged statistical system to be able to provide hindcast river basins, in the basins that she's looked at, and I presume she's moving that forward for sort of a North American analysis here. In terms of the process-based workflow, sort of an interesting approach, looking at a perfect modeling forecast, a perfect simulation, and basically perturbing two things, if you like, in terms of the ensembles, looking at basically different climatological forcing or meteorological forcing. So start with a perfect initial condition, if you like, and then move forward with it with a series of projected forecasts, and look at the resulting ensemble streamflow forecasts. So that was kind of the first approach in looking at this deterministic or this ensemble approach. And so the second way of looking at it was basically to spin up the model with different initial conditions, and then use the perfect meteorological forecast. So kind of invert the problem, if you like, and then look at the resulting simulations on the forecast there. And so she was able to come up with what I think is a fairly interesting plot here on sort of lead times and predictability, where if you look at the perturbation, I guess, of the initial conditions versus the meteorological forcing, you can see some interesting patterns in how these things cross with respect to skill. And so in the early lead times, it looks like the meteorological forcing has a large influence in terms of improving the skill. And then as you go on, it's the initial conditions that actually dominate, and things kind of go back and forth. So that's just an example for the Kootenai, I believe, at this point. And I'm sure she's working hard in developing the same type of framework for all the basins across in her domain, and then of course the analysis for North America. Next project is Dave Casson's. Dave just starting his PhD, so he's early days in pulling this together. So if you have any questions for Dave on his approach, you should reach out to him. But basically the idea here is looking at data assimilation for improved forecasting and focus on snow. I don't think it's any surprise to anybody here that there's a lot of uncertainty in snow modeling and measurements. There's not a lot of measurements, and so the whole idea of estimating seasonal snow mass is still a technical and scientific challenge. I think we're all aware of that. And so basically, Dave's looking at sort of classic data assimilation techniques applied to snowpacks, using a variety of observations, including in situ snow pillows, satellite extent, and possibly some airborne imagery. So the idea here is to basically look at like I said, classic data assimilation methods to see if we can improve the initial conditions and move things forward. And so, we'll see where this leads. But like I said, if you have any questions for on this project, feel free to talk to Dave, or any advice, because he's just starting. That would be great. So he's developing some data assimilation test beds. He'll be using the SUMA hydrological modeling framework, and of course looking at a variety of in situ and remotely sensed snow data. So that's the kind of the data flow he's looking at. He's looking at sort of a North American wide effort in the end, but he's focusing on some test beds right now to kind of move this project forward. The other one is, and John talked about this at one of our previous talks, is really a next gen effort here looking at snowcast. Snowcast is an operational product, if you like, a quasi-operational product coming out of GWF. And basically it's using the CHM model, high resolution deterministic forecast, and trying to predict basically what the snowpack's going to look like over a 2-day and a 6-day period. So a lot of you have seen these slides before. So the system is working, and it's being extended to other parts of the country. And so with the CHM model, we're able to, through, this is the work done by Chris Marsh, this was his PhD thesis, be able to move, to look at snow forecast over a 2 to 6 day period, and basically characterize things like snow water equivalent and snow depth, then obviously the change over that period. So this is a simulation domain. This is a bit of an old slide for an area around Calgary. This is fairly high resolution work and requires fairly high computational load, but the domain is divided, and I think this is still correct, into about 130,000 triangles, and basically calculates most of the physical processes, I think, including some recent work, I believe, published by Vincent Viennet and Chris and others on looking at things like avalanching as well as part of this system. And so it's probably one of the most sophisticated snow models, if not the most sophisticated snow model right now globally. And so there'll be a lot of advances in the next generation system. So part of what we want to do in the forecasting group is determine how we can better use these types of products in forecasting in general, flow forecasting as well. So the last, or the second to last one is to look at setting up the mesh model for large forecasting. So we did this kind of at the request of the Yukon government. As we mentioned, they really only had some fairly standard regression equations and the knowledge of some long-standing individuals who worked in the Yukon for many years. So there's a lot of sort of institutional knowledge there in terms of their flow forecasting. But as people retire or leave, Rick Janowitz being probably a key person in the Yukon that dealt with all of this, they needed to formalize the system a bit. So we set up a prototype. This is work done by Zlalom and with some help from Dan Prince, and Mohammed Al-Shami did a lot of the heavy lifting as well. So we ran a mesh version of the model for the Yukon River Basin here. This is a pretty big basin. Overall, it's the 5th largest basin in North America, and it's fairly complex. It's high relief, lots of glaciers, and it drains a fairly large area. And so we forecasted right up to Eagle, Alaska, so on the US side, pretty much the entire Yukon part of the basin. So this is what it looks like in detail, and you can see there's it's complex, lots of massive ice fields along the White River and in the Yukon headwaters, and then lots of lakes, lots of challenges with respect to routing, and then of course dealing with high relief and snowpacks and very little data. I mean, that's just the reality up in the Yukon, and so that's always a challenge. So we applied the GRU version of the mesh model. We looked at a couple of configurations for mesh, one that include a mountain mesh version. So what we call is basically we just add more GRUs by looking at things like slope and aspect. And we ran a regular version of that. And we actually did this with a cloud-based server, and we're able to produce, get into the mode of producing operational forecasts. In a sense, universities aren't necessarily the best institutions to set up operational forecasts, but we just wanted to do a trial and see what we could hand over, I guess, to the government of the Yukon. And so we developed a system to test and evaluate what was possible. So this is kind of how the system works. It's pretty standard. We do a little bit of a hindcast, I guess, to get the initial conditions right for the model. And then we run the RDPS and the RDPA analysis and then the GDPS to do the forecast. So the global deterministic and the regional deterministic forecasts are run, and this is the kinds of results we are providing them. So we do bring in the observed hydrometric data at certain stations, and then issue the forecasts. So this is the kind of product we provide. It runs on basically some scripts, but we had some help from folks like Kevin Shook and others to develop these scripts. And we basically email these on a daily basis to the folks in the Yukon as a bit of a, again, a bit of a guidance system for them to look at. So we've also set up these quasi-operational systems in a few other basins. Again, working closely with ECCC to see how we can help these entities take advantage of some of the products and services that these sort of global models can produce. Another project is the development of fuse modules for forecasting. This is led by the group in McMaster. The idea here is to look at enhances in hydrological forecasting. So we've got a fuse setup that the McMaster team pulled together, and they're looking at data assimilation algorithm based on evolutionary theory. So again, if you have specific questions, I'd direct you to the McMaster team. But basically, the idea was to set up a platform using Fuse and the mesh model, which is compatible with the Fuse platform, and look at some spatial temporally downscaling and some data assimilation techniques, mostly focused on changing state variables and some of the parameters, which is interesting in the model to see if they can get better forecasts, essentially. So this EDA system basically determines a Pareto optimal solution at each assimilation time step and provides updated model states and parameters. And so testing this on a small scale, I'm not sure where they're at with their results, and we look forward to hearing that. But this seems like an interesting approach, right? Where you look at an optimal set of parameters and then do the forecast from there. As everybody understands, parameter estimation is difficult in these large systems. There's many parameters. And so this is really interesting work, and we're looking forward to the results. And again, these are the types of approaches I think that can lend themselves well to a kind of a national framework. The other aspect they're looking at is the spatial temporal downscaling. So looking at machine learning algorithms to develop downscaling techniques for enhanced hydrological forecasting. So these are looking at some of the GDPS and RDPS products and seeing if they can downscale those in a meaningful way for the forecasting systems. So they do have an operational setup on the Grand River watershed, and it is running Fuse, and this is the basis for a lot of their experimentation. So a couple of things. One is the results I think coming out of this can inform the national guidance system in some ways, which would be helpful, but will also be quite informative for the sort of the bespoke modeling and sort of the local level as well. So really encouraged by these results and this work being done at McMaster. And the last thing, and this one's interesting because it sort of came up as during our conversation with the provinces as a real sort of benchmark effort that's required in Canada, which we tend to focus on runoff, rainfall runoff, or we tend to focus on things like snowpack and melt season, from a forecasting perspective, and of course as hydrologists, this is where we put a lot of effort. But ice jam forecasting is a big issue in Canada, and we probably haven't given it enough attention. This came out clearly, I think, from the provinces and territories when we had the discussions with them. So, but people like Carl Eric and Pravin and Sujata have done some great work, and so a lot of this has actually been incorporated into some of the operational systems, various provincial agencies across Canada. So it's really nice that we've got some leadership there through some individuals, and this is turning out to be maybe a bigger thrust with respect to the forecasting group than we initially thought. So why is it a concern? Well, I think everybody understands that that when you do get an ice jam, and they do happen reasonably frequently in Canada, stage discharge relationships fall apart. You get high water levels for similar flows because basically you've created an artificial dam. And so understanding, you know, if these dams, these ice jams will occur, or understanding if they do occur, when they will release, is absolutely critical to trying to plan for evacuations and other things. And so we have a history of these across Canada. For those of you who haven't seen an ice jam, and I've been fortunate enough to actually survey an ice jam back in my early career, these things are impressive. If you could predict them, they'd make a great tourist attraction too. But these are massive things, right? And so they are significant, and they happen regularly, and they're difficult problems to solve. So what we did was, or what Carl's group did basically, was coupling a river ice model to the mesh system. So the mesh system provides kind of the boundary conditions, if you like, for these river ice systems, stream flow, and some of the hydrological, meteorological forcing information. And so basically, the model was set up to predict potential ice induced backwater levels, and look at potential ice jam floods within a 10-day lead time. The other thing we looked at was when the breakup would occur. And so this, again, is Carl's group looking at the mesh RBM system. So this is basically a temperature model, trying to estimate the water temperature to see what would happen with respect to the ice jam release, and when the breakup would occur, and sort of look at the dynamics of that. And so the mesh RBM system was tested operationally in the Athabasca River for 2019 breakup, and also for hindcast 2016, 2017, and 2018. So again, similar type of approach where you pull the sort of a link modeling approach, where you pull out the hydrological and hydraulic variables out of the mesh system, and then run a temperature model to see if you can forecast a breakup date. So there's some preliminary results. So on the left, you can see sort of what the mesh model sees as a river. And then on the right, you see what some of the information from observational flights and other things. So we're able to simulate, if you look at the time series, it goes from sort of right, sort of left to right here. So April 3rd, 4th, and 5th, you can see basically the predictions of the temperature increasing. These are two sets of forecasts where things change dramatically in the second forecast on April 3rd, where you can see the water temperature increasing substantially towards the end of the period. And this seemed to match well with the observations, at least in terms of the dynamics of the ice system. So really positive and encouraging results out of that. And last slides, just quickly, is the National Flood Forecasting Workshop. So believe it or not, Canada has never had national flood forecasting workshops in the past, really systematically. So GWF started that ball rolling, I guess, with the first one in 2019 in Vancouver with ECCC, as we introduced the new numerical guidance program that we're developing within ECCC. And then we had a follow-on up this year. It was virtual, obviously, but we had more than 200 attendees this time. So there's pent-up demand for this, and there's a real need in Canada. So it's been nice to work through GWF and with ECC to develop this. And I think there's been a lot of uptake from the provinces and territories, and from some of the international folks as well, including NOAA and the ECMWF folks. So just a quick summary, flow forecasting in Canada. I just hope this is clear as a partnership requiring a series of approaches and models. I think I sort of highlighted some of those. There is really no national approach yet. ECC is developing a national, not federal, flow guidance system. I think that's clear. And I would argue that the provinces and territories are now retooling their systems to take advantage of these new services. So there's a real big role for groups like FloodNet and for groups like GWF to help kind of advance some of that. I think it's important to recognize that ECC, NOAA, ECMWF, amongst others, will be producing global hydrological forecasts. And so how does this all come together in the global community will be an interesting challenge. It'll be difficult to navigate in some ways, but I think we need to be prepared for that. So that's kind of where the future is going. In terms of GWS and our forecasting team, we're focused on kind of three main areas that I discussed earlier. Improve flow guidance, work with global centers through collaboration, and I think we want to assist in the development of the Canadian and global community of practice. Given there's so many players, I think some type of community of practice needs to be considered here, and how that works in the long run is not obvious, but I think certainly something to consider. And I think lastly, and we've been meeting with the KM team on this a little bit, there's a large opportunity of a knowledge mobilization effort here on the flood forecasting side, and we should think about that. So how do we get some of this into the hands of the forecasting agencies in the provinces and territories, or maybe even at the municipal level? Needs to be thought out. So we will be working with the KM team to develop a bit of a strategy. So on that note, Pravin, I think that's it. And hopefully there's a bit of time for questions. I was 5 minutes over, I apologize.
Thank you all. That was very informative and presentation. I will be moving now to the question and answer session. I will let the questions trickle in. I'll just start with one question that I have. So there has been so much progress by research community, but often those advances are not translated, into the operational work done by the provincial agencies. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on what research community and provincial agencies should be doing differently to bridge the operational and research gaps.
Yeah, so given all the years I've worked, both on the federal side for 28 years, 29 years, and then on the now on the academic side, and of course being involved with academia my whole career, I've noticed and that the development gap has actually increased in this country, and so GWF is trying to close that development gap. FloodNet did the same thing; they tried to close that development gap, and so there's a bit of a struggle, I guess, or a bit of a difficulty, in the provinces. And having been on that side of things, really, there might be 3 or 4 forecasters in an office, right? And they're busy answering questions from the deputy minister and everybody else, and don't really get a lot of time to kind of put new things into place, right? And of course, a new thing, any kind of new effort takes a lot of time to test and evaluate. And, in fairness to those agencies, they're usually not given a lot of time to do that kind of work. And so this is why I think if we can do something on the knowledge mobilization front within GWF to figure out how do we make that better. So it's almost a social science question in a way, right? And I think we can make some real advancements, right? And so 2 things, the community practice, I think will help. Because if people share information, it's a lot better than trying to do it on your own. So I think these forecasting forums have been great for that. And 2, I think we should really try to tackle the problem head on. And I'm hopeful that the new agency, actually the new Canada Water Agency, will try to bring that forward, right? And I think one of the arguments for building a new agency is to actually really close that development gap so that people are able to take advantage of some of this new technology, right? I'll just add one more point. I mean, the last thing you want is, as a forecaster in anywhere in Canada, is for somebody from ECMWF to say, "Oh, we've predicted that 5 days ago." That's the last thing you want, because they don't tell you how many times they missed the forecast. So they might have, you could sit there in ECMWF and issue a warning every 5 days, right? But as a forecaster, you're not going to do that, and so it's a real dilemma, I think, that's going to come, right? And so I think we should prepare our colleagues to deal with that over the next little while. So yeah, there's lots to work to do.
The next question is from Walter, and so he says, "Hi all, it's very nice to see this overview. You mentioned that for forecasting, it is important that the forecaster is comfortable with the model they use. Can you shed some lights on how a model becomes accepted for use by forecasting agency? For example, are there formal minimum accuracy requirements a model must meet? or is this more related to general confidence in an understanding of the model that grows over time?
Yeah, having never been a flood forecaster myself, I'm probably out on a limb here in answering the question, but I will say, having done a lot of modeling over my career and actually having to make decisions with models, it's probably a bit of both, right? I mean, you want to put enough rigor in terms of the model development that you're comfortable with, whatever the Nash-Sutcliffe outputs, and you do some experiments to make sure that the model is working and doing what you expect it to do. You would likely want to have enough flexibility as a modeler to be able to do things like double the snowpack in case you're looking at a forecast and see what the result is. So, give credit to some of the folks like James Craig, I'm not sure if he's on, who's developed things like Raven that are kind of quick and very solid models. And I think there's a lot more uptake on those bespoke models like Raven in the provinces, which is great to see. So it's a bit of both. It's a bit of your professional comfort with how the model's performing, and then some rigorous engineering sort of testing, I think, are the two things, right? The issue becomes, if you're going to evacuate a small town somewhere, that's your decision as a forecaster, right? And those are hard decisions to make. And so, and they cost a lot of money, right? And if you mess up and you make the wrong call, it's painful, right? And so we ask a lot of these people, and we only ask them to do it in some cases one every 20 years because you don't get a flood every year, right? And so it's really a tough job at the end of the day, right? And so the more tools we can give them, I think the better off they'll be. So hopefully that answered the question.
Thanks. The next question is from John, and John is asking, can the models used for flood forecasting, set to seasonal, also be used to inform floodplain mapping? What would it take to use these new developments for both?
Yeah, so I think what we want to do on the floodplain mapping side is a couple of things. I mean, the traditional approach to floodplain mapping is, if you have a water survey gauge, that's what you use. You estimate the frequency analysis. You might want to build climate change into that frequency analysis. There's a lot of good work done in FloodNet and GWF and in sort of those areas over the years, right? And so if you have a gauge, that's great. You can measure things, and you have a long enough time series, you can do something. Of course, the problem becomes is where you don't have a gauge, right? And so there's only, whatever it is, 2,800 gauges in Canada. And there's lots of communities that have no gauge at the right spot, right? And so then it becomes a question of can you develop a time series? And so, my view has always been, through the models we're developing, like mesh and hopefully the next gen systems, that we can actually do a really detailed reanalysis, right? And do a long time series and kind of develop those frequency analyses, based on a number of criteria, including the model outputs, so that you could actually hopefully have a system in place where you should be able to click on a map, kind of like what they're trying to do in the US with the National Water Model, and understand what the frequency analysis looks like, and develop these sort of maps, right? So I think that's the long-term vision here, and I think it's actually technically possible to do that. And so we should strive for at least trying to address that in GWF, sort of make the first steps, and then hopefully we can do something like that for the long run. And then, of course, look at the climate change issue as well, right? Because we are dealing with a non-stationary system. So
thanks. So there's one more question from Khaled Akhtar, and probably it will be the last question for today. So the question is, are you planning to use artificial intelligence or machine learning in producing real-time flood map?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some efforts, not a lot. I mean, I know Paul Coulibaly and his team are looking at that from the sort of meteorological forcing side. And there's a couple of efforts going on with machine learning and artificial intelligence, and we're thinking about it from a model sort of parameterization perspective, I think. And I know for the not part of the forecasting team, but part of the IMPC effort in terms of the comparison study that was done on the Great Lakes and is probably going to carry forward on, well, is carrying forward on the Saskatchewan-Nelson system, is they did look at the machine learning approaches, I guess, for at least, not necessarily a forecast, but for at least a simulation, right? A hindcast, long-term hindcast, and you know, with some mixed results. So yes, I think we're all open to that. I mean, part of GWF is sort of looking at big data and how to do it. I can honestly say we haven't looked at it a lot in terms of this particular forecasting group, but any ideas folks have, you know, let me know, and you know, we might look at that down the road, right? There certainly is room for it. There's some great machine learning systems out there, right? And we need to make sure that we can use those tools. So I think from a forecasting perspective, there's probably some benefit to those types of systems, and we probably should explore it a little more carefully.
Thanks, Al. We're 1 minute past the hour mark, so I think we'll stop the question and answer session here today. Thank you again. And I also want to thank everyone that attended this webinar. Just a reminder again that this is our final webinar for 2020 and 2021 session. We'll be back again later in fall with the second season of core modeling webinar. So please stay tuned. We'll also be releasing the schedule in coming months. You'll also soon receive an email from me with a link to view all previous recordings. That will be all for today. Al, do you have any final words?
No, I just recognized I got a note from Joseph here. Joseph was involved in the I forgot to mention his name, heavily involved in the Yukon forecasting experiment as well. It took a lot of his life, and I apologize, Joseph, I forgot to mention your name, but Joseph Lukili was definitely involved in that. So I just wanted to shout out to him that, yeah, thanks for all the effort there, Joseph. Okay.
Right. Wish everyone a good day.
Good.
Bye.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.